Hey everyone, it's Reed. I want to say thanks so much for listening to the Homefront and keeping us growing. Here's what I need you to do. After you're done listening, or while you're listening, I need you to go and rate this 5 stars. Guys, you give us those ratings, more people see us, more people listen, and the movement grows. Please give the Homefront a 5-star rating today. And as always, thanks for listening. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the Homefront. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Dave Troy, a tech entrepreneur, historian, and investigative journalist who covers the intersection of technology and democracy. Dave is currently the publisher and editor of his ghost newsletter, America 2.0, which is focused on the future of democracy in America and around the world. He also writes a monthly column, The Wide Angle, for the Washington Spectator, and hosts his podcast, Dave Troy Presents. Today, he's coming to us from Vancouver, Canada. Dave, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here, Reed. Thanks for having me.
So Dave, there's so many different places to go, but this is one thing that I asked about right when we started. So I'll throw you right in the deep end of the pool. As I've been thinking about what we're seeing now in America, the United States 2025, and what you guys are at the front row of in Canada, is it seems to me that where we are now in American and even really world politics, we didn't come to overnight. You know, in the immediate post-war world, there was the Cold War, right? It was two-sided, the Soviets and the Americans. You were on one side or the other. Freedom, communism, capitalism, centrally planned economies, et cetera. But as communism started to fall away under its own weight, and you saw that like the rise of both neoconservatism and neoliberalism, ironically enough, at the same time, really became something where, as Ronald Reagan took hold, there was really only one countervailing view of the world that really stuck with us from my perspective until Trump showed up, not because he was opposite to it, but just because he was different from it. And now we're in a place where there is these bad guys on the march. They seem to be a post-belief set of goons, right? They're not Marxist-Leninists. They're not fascists, right? They're all, as Anne Applebaum might call them, kleptocrats. So why is it that over the course of these last few decades, there has been all the money, all the thought, all the people, all the work done on the right to get us to this place, but really no, at least from my perspective, and again, I don't come from the political left, no corresponding work from the left on that.
I think a big part of this has been, there's been kind of a set of grievances that has been nursed by the right for decades. And you can take it all the way back to really the New Deal is like a good starting point, although the next stop behind that is kind of the Civil War and various other inflection points. So let's just take the New Deal thing, since 1933, there has been grievance over fiat currency versus gold and central banking versus hard money. And so basically what happened with the, passage of the New Deal was that Franklin Roosevelt needed, a lot of dollars to pay for the New Deal programs. And so took basically the U.S. off of gold as the, one-to-one standard. And that process then accelerated, and then 1971 was when Nixon decoupled fully from the international system, the US dollar from gold. And that, of course, sent, this network of people into a tizzy because they were super concerned about inflation and whatnot. And of course, there was a lot of inflation during the 1970s, but that had a lot to do with oil and, policies related to that. So, it's a complex set of factors, but that is like one core thread that runs through all of this is like, what is the nature of money? And we see that coming back now with like cryptocurrency and stuff. And the bottom line is that all of these networks that sort of have the same grievance have kind of found each other and are working together towards a common goal. And so if you think about Putin's grievance, well, it happens to be about the dollar. Because at the end of the day, he believes that the U.S. dollar is what allows the American government to participate in military adventurism and that sort of thing. So to the extent that Russia, China, the conservative right all sort of have the same basic grievance about fiat currency, they have found each other and are working towards a common goal. The problem on the left is that, we've been kind of just going along with the status quo and trying to quote unquote, defend democracy and keep things more or less on an even keel and, have stability and stuff. But that puts us in the defensive position of kind of defending the status quo. And of course, the status quo has a lot of, flaws and warts and stuff. So, to a lot of people that aren't familiar with this longer history, they're kind of looking at this and going, well, do I want the status quo or do I want the exciting new crypto enabled, world free of fiat currency and ending all wars, which is the message that these people are selling. So I think a lot of younger people also that don't really remember the Cold War or have any exposure to this longer term history, they could get excited by this vision. So you see a lot of young tech people being drawn into it as well. And so, just to put it in really basic terms, I think that the autocrats and authoritarians that have this kind of vision for replacing the existing dollar system have a kind of forward-looking vision that they are selling to people, and those of us that would prefer to have more democratic controls are offering what amounts to a backward-looking, defense of the status quo, and, you can see why that might not be working.
Yeah, well, interesting too is that if you think about, let's just talk about the immediate post World War II era, right? In places like, Orange County, California, where I used to live, you had this confluence of wealthy businessmen and religious people, and they sort of come up with the John Wayne myth, right? The rugged individualism. And then you add onto that in the 80s, the religious right comes of age for real, right? Now they claim it was because of Roe v. Wade, but that's not really true. I think it's that they saw Southern evangelical Democrat got elected and they didn't like that either. But in the 80s, then it's this weird, again, confluence of, Reaganomics, big oil, and religion. And then they just keep tacking different things on. So back then it was those things, now it's tech. And those are the strange things is they all tend to be, you know, white guys, and then they all seem to come to this almost messianic thing, right? So now there's the tech guy who puts his kid's blood in his body to try and reverse aging, and obviously you
Yeah.
could take Bezos or Musk with the Mars and the other guys who are working towards immortality, and then of course, and I'm sure you've got a lot of things to say about something like artificial intelligence, but there seems to be now like this God complex, whether or not it's in and of themselves or as like tech will save us from everything, which of course, everybody always says that, but nothing's black and white. There's always a consequence to any brand new thing, especially as powerful as these things are.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and you're identifying several trends that are kind of overlapping, and the thing that you see that the tech people have in common with the religious people is this kind of, eschatological end times, dispensational millenarianism kind of view of the world that everything is going to change really soon. And if everything's going to really change this much, then it kind of means you don't have to do your homework and you don't have to prepare for school the next day because the world's ending like in 3 days. So it kind of brings on that kind of mentality of like the old rules, the old systems, the old controls no longer apply. We are preparing for the great singularity. We are preparing for the second coming. We are preparing for the omega point. Whatever particular, eschatological philosophy you choose to believe in, you can map all those things onto the same set of goals and, effectively align yourselves around the idea of like, better. First off, that, your in group is the group that knows what's really happening, and that the people that are trying to, prevent the coming about of the great awakening or, the next phase or the singularity are in fact the problem because they don't understand. They just will never understand. And we have to fight them and marginalize them and put them in jail and arrest them and, all the things that we kind of see happening now. So it's kind of all converging into this, sort of unified syncretic philosophy that's, I think, quite dangerous because it gives people a reason to dispense with the rule of law.
So I read Mark Andreessen's Manifesto, if you
Yeah.
can call it that, which was, it was like a kid who had to write a 20-page paper, so they did like 2.5 spaces between each line tape,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah, yeah.
it was very thin, and lots of quotes that like took from whatever thing that he wanted to. But to me, the takeaway was, and I think this speaks to the point, which is we're all great, we're really smart, we're really rich, and if you aren't, too bad. right? And he quotes Hayek, right, which is basically like this is all going to redound to the elite's benefit anyway. And then you've got this guy Curtis Yarvin, who I know you've spoken a lot about, who's this weird programmer who I've read a lot about, and has this idea of a CEO monarch. And then you've got Teal out there, and you've got a guy like the former Attorney General Bill Barr, who is 100% behind the unitary executive theory, right, which is basically the president is in fact a king and can do no wrong. And then just as we're recording this, they just had the what's left of the White House Correspondents' dinner in
Yeah,
Washington, D.C.,
yeah.
where none of the administration was allowed to attend, and obviously Donald Trump didn't attend, but they had their own parties, and then in the midst of that, announced their own super special private entrance only club for only the wealthiest and most loyal.
That's right. Yeah, and so, you mentioned Andreessen's manifesto, and, if the way you can kind of read it is either you're with us or you're against us, and he, lists a bunch of people who he considers to be with them, and I know some of them, and it's people that are basically tech cheerleaders and aren't terribly, critical of, like, where this might go, and then he kind of, sets himself against the broader enemies of people that, would slow down this accelerationism. And look, my background is in tech. I'm pretty pro tech. I think there's a lot of great things that have come from it. And, I think that managed properly, there are ways to have it affect great good in the world. But, what's kind of been weird to watch is that as the tech industry has kind of shifted, like if you remember 10, 15, 20 years ago, the tech industry was perceived as being quite liberal. And, people would think, oh, it's, California lefties, crunchy granola doing weird tech stuff. But, that was true to some extent, but it was also accompanied by this very libertarian conservative strain that was kind of running alongside of it. And people, refer to that as the California ideology. And you started to see that emerge in the 70s and 60s with, like the Whole Earth catalog and Stewart Brand and that kind of stuff. And, that had a huge impact. But then by the time you get into the 90s, you had like John Perry Barlow with his like declaration of the independence of cyberspace, which pretty much set out the idea that, things that happen online, the old rules no longer apply. And it set out this kind of sci-fi libertarian worldview that, was kind of like, "Oh, okay, that's sort of interesting." That's an interesting experiment to play with in the realm of the internet, but the internet was pretty small in 96 or whatever that was. And now the internet is, how we do things. This is part of our lifeblood of information flow, and it's how we perceive the world. So I think that, a lot of these kinds of chickens that were sort of seen as fringy have kind of come home to roost. And, this particular generation also of kind of particularly the folks centered around the PayPal network, so Musk and Thiel and David Sachs and, Reid Hoffman and others have exercised such high amounts of agency in terms of kind of imposing their worldview on people and doing so pretty effectively, that they have, been able to kind of punch above their weight to some extent in terms of advancing some of these ideas that, really had been kind of fringy, but are now becoming, part of the government. I mean, in the literal terms, if you look at Sachs and Musk, they're actually part of the government right now. So, I think it's a remarkable turn of events, and I think people, in general, don't appreciate just kind of like how nefarious and how deep this all runs, and people need to get a better handle on how we're going to try to combat this going forward.
So, about 10 years ago, I worked for an organization called Lincoln Labs. Not Lincoln Project, which I helped co-found a few years later, but Lincoln Labs. And then they were the California ideology, Dave, that you're talking about. And the idea here was younger guys, I mean, they were probably only 3 or 4 years younger than me then, but, guys a little bit younger than me, not really political in nature, but they were all big fans of Mitt Romney in the 2012 campaign. Romney's tech, such as it was, and I think It would seem almost fanciful, the kind of stuff, or laughable, I should say, the things they couldn't get done on that campaign. But it led to this idea that, like, the right must have its own ability to compete politically in the tech and online space. The Romney campaign couldn't do it. So we would have these conferences. We had some in DC. We had a couple in San Francisco. They were always incredibly well attended. We were always able to get national political reporters to come, right? And Rand Paul came a couple of times, and we had all these people. And so it was a very, like, there was a lot of energy there. But looking back, Dave, I was sort of at the front row of history, or weird history. Like, I remember meeting Steve Bannon there, right? I remember meeting the guys from Cambridge Analytica, and they're telling me what they're doing, and having grown up in politics, going, like, "Where did you guys come from?"
Right.
I wasn't suspicious. I was like, I've done this all my life. I've never heard of psychography or whatever the hell they called it. I'd never heard of them as a company. The crypto people were there, and they were not like, how do I launder money, or how do I do what Sam Bankman-Fried did? It was very much a philosophical, like, freedom thing. And then of course the seasteading weirdness of Peter Thiel, of creating literal islands. So all that stuff was going on, and I'll just tell you, Dave, like, I was not imaginative enough to understand what was going on. And I wasn't clever enough to say, like, why are all these people with giant wooden crosses walking around, right? Like, around their necks.
Well, I mean, it took me a lot of exposure to this to really sort of connect the dots. And I think, I began to kind of understand the broader arc of this in, I guess, around late 2020, early 2021. And, I was starting to talk to people that were, journalists and writers and stuff who had been covering this for a long time. And I'm like, guys, I really think this goes back to the gold standard grievance to a large extent. And they were kind of like, maybe, I don't know, and then I started looking into it. And then by, I guess, mid 2022, I wrote a piece called Paranoia on Parade that covers 90 years of history from 1933 to, up to like 2022. It really just lays out the, one network of people leads to the next network of people. And so, the whole Reagan Revolution thing, 1981, that was the Council for National Policy. Those people were born out of the National Association of Manufacturers, the same network that launched the John Birch Society. It was the Council for National Policy, for the most part, that planned and executed January 6th. So it was kind of like, okay, all right, this worldview, and this is something that people underappreciate, is the idea that worldviews persist through history and they're sort of irreducible. They don't really go away because they always attract new adherents in the next generation. And people that had, a grievance in 1933 had the same grievance in 1955. It's just different people.
Right.
So, it's like it transmits itself through history and it never goes away. And to the extent that these worldviews end up merging. And so in the case of Russia, people are always wondering, well, how is it possible that, you know, uh, people that were, aligned with Reagan would now be aligned with Putin? And the answer is because Russia is not a monolith. Russia is, in fact, made up of different factions. And for a long time, it was, the communists and the Reds and all of that were running things. And then over time, it became the white Russians, the people that, that were royalists and resisting the communists. They ended up running Russia. And so that's really Putin's network now is this, remnants of white Russians and white Russian ideology that do align with what the conservative right was about in the 1980s.
Right.
So it's like it kind of all makes sense, but you have to look at it through this like long-term lens of factions and alignment.
So let me go back to, you mentioned the early 30s. So, in 33, Hitler comes to power. 33, Roosevelt, FDR, comes to office in the wake of the Great Depression. As you said, he talked about the New Deal. I asked another guest this. I mean, do you think that the New Deal also was possible not only because of the crisis we were in, but also because the specter of communism, of Marxism, Leninism was there, and that the business community or the barons in this country were like, well, hell, if the whole thing goes down, then we're going to get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of the reasonable person's take on it. I think the right wing industrialists, kind of the old money people, they viewed their control over gold as a way to control the government, basically, because their thinking was, well, the government can't spend money it doesn't have, and if we control most of the money, then that limits the government's capabilities. And so, what kind of irked them was, the very first thing that Roosevelt did when he came into office in March of 1933, because we used to inaugurate presidents in March.
Right.
was to close the banks for a few days, and he also issued an executive order 6102 that, called for the seizure of all private holdings of gold, basically saying, "Look, we're gonna need to issue a bunch of money. We need all the gold we can get in the, treasury," and so he, basically set out like a gold buyback program, and people were annoyed at that because they were like, "What? You can't keep us from holding gold." So that was kind of the, big bang that set off all of this reactionary response to Roosevelt's New Deal. And so from that was born a whole litany of anti New Deal organizations, some of which were more successful than others. But what they found was that the populist movements were way more successful than these kinds of elitist, like, let's get together and talk about how terrible the New Deal is kind of clubs. It was more like there was a cult called I Am that was like worshiping gold, and they were doing chants against Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Like, it was really lowbrow kind of stuff that ended up working. But now, like, Mike Flynn's been, known to repeat these I am prayers that he learned from, like, his mother, from the 1930s. So it's like it all passes down through history, and now we're dealing with the aftermath of it.
Would I be correct to say then that the plutocrat class has always more than utilized to their own benefit the populist chanters, for lack of a better way to put it? That they've always found just enough to get along with, and maybe it's keeping them angry, whatever the shared philosophy is. Because what it seems like a lot of this stuff that you read, Dave, is like in 1984, right? There's the party people, and then there's the plebs, right? And they're happy for the plebs to live whatever life they're gonna live down there, so long as they get to control up here.
Yes, exactly right. And, as far as the plebs are concerned, as long as they don't start causing trouble or, getting too much power, then they can basically just be left alone to do their thing. And I think, I forget whose quote this was, the line about Americans imagine themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I think that was Steinbeck, actually. And, the idea that, like, "Oh, no, I'm really part of the elite. I'm just not very rich right now, but in the future, I'm gonna get rich, and I'll be joining you there in the elite soon." So, there's this kind of, aspirational mindset that has always informed kind of American populism, and I think they've used that to great effect. Because why else would it be that people, that are not that wealthy living in rural areas would be identifying with billionaires, like, and being on their side? Like, it doesn't really make any sense.
For me, that's always been, to your point, maybe, is that they flipped the script, which is when the aspirational nature didn't work anymore because the working class folks that you're talking about didn't believe it, then it had to be those people took it from you. The system is rigged and it's their fault.
No, and I think that there's a distinct, kind of scapegoat element to this, and, Peter Thiel is known to be a, acolyte of a philosopher named René Girard, who came up with this idea of scapegoat theory. And the idea is that, we all mimic each other in terms of like what we want. So you see, a guy with the pretty woman in the fast car, and you want the pretty woman in the fast car. And that's what Gerard argues, like, drives people in society to, like, do things and to get up out of bed in the mornings to get the pretty woman in the nice car. The thing is that it baked into that, Gerard posits that there is this idea of the scapegoat, and that the reason why you don't have the pretty woman in the nice car is because of them. And if you could just merely eliminate or otherwise marginalize the them, then your life is going to be great and you're going to get the pretty woman in the nice car. So that ends up becoming kind of a motivating factor within how these messages are presented. And so it's been like sort of merged in with, the idea of memes, and of course memes being like Richard Dawkins' selfish gene versus mimetic, which is Gerard. So what people are finding is that the realm of social media has been incredibly useful for sort of defining the scapegoat. And so all of the sort of things that work really well on social media where, you're digging against the out group, tend to just drive traffic like crazy. And so, you see that on both the left and the right. The people that are performing the best and have like the most followers and the most retweets and all that are the ones that are really giving it to the out group and the scapegoat. And so, this whole structure of social media is basically designed to promote this very simplistic in-group, out-group division and scapegoating. And, unfortunately, anybody that studies genocide and other sorts of war type contexts knows that, as soon as you start scapegoating people at scale and do it long enough, you will end up with genocide type situations and, shipping people off to prisons and whatever else. So, I mean, that's sort of the path that we're on. And it's sort of a structural failing of all the, kind of tech that we've built. It's leading us down that path.
Well, yeah, and I was in college, probably weren't maybe just out of college when it happened, but we intentionally allowed that, right? We said we're not going to put any brakes on the internet. I want to get to to AI in that regard in a second, but I want to stay for a second on what you were talking about, which is this whole idea of the car and the pretty girl, because of course there's a scarcity problem too. There's only so many pretty girls and so many fast cars that either A, you can afford to buy, or B, you're charming enough or successful enough or just a good enough guy enough to attract the pretty girl. And so if 98 out of 100 guys can't get that, then there's, to your point, like nobody wants to believe it's their fault. And then you have this guy like Andrew Tate, right? Who not only espouses that kind of stuff, but also makes money on 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old guys saying, if you act like this, you'll get the girl. And if you don't, it's not my fault for you giving me 12 bucks a month. It's your fault for being a loser, which drives them further into this ugliness and further into that dark pit. Because, of course, as you said, Dave, like the bottom line is it can't possibly be my fault.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, just being drawn into that content web of somebody like an Andrew Tate, but also, I mean, others almost equally as bad as in like Jordan Peterson or, even Joe Rogan is sort of the light version of all that. It draws people into this worldview that like, oh, well, this is how people should be. And then they get exposed to all kinds of other adjacent messaging that brings them into the fold of this, what I would call an irreducible worldview that, is very potent and isn't really going away and, in fact, is, continuing to persist and is becoming dominant. These are things that, those of us that are on the other side of this really need to be paying attention to in terms of how this functions so that we can start to, mount some sort of reasonable response to it.
Let's talk about that. In Noah Harari's latest book, he said the answer to more information is not more information. In fact, it's community, it's communication, not information. And so, Dave, you mentioned this, which is every day, guys like you and me have another podcast, right? So there's no shortage of podcasts. You're on Ghost, but there's no shortage of Substacks. There's no shortage of Instagram accounts or TikTok accounts. So we're awash in this stuff. And as you said, there are different people who become popular for different reasons. And you talked about the othering, right? And so what you see on the right is who makes the most fun of libs or beta males or whatever. And on the left, it's who's the best at being funny about, the mouth breathing nitwits that are MAGA, right? And ha ha ha, look what's happening to you. Is the only path out of that the collapse of something like we're seeing? And, sort of a phoenix rising for the rubble? Or is there something that can and should be done as we're going down this road?
Well, I've given this a lot of thought and I've been kind of working on writing on this topic for the last few years. And the kind of conclusion that I've reached is that what we're really dealing with is a societal structural problem where we are being divided into these two very clearly defined in groups and out groups and there's even evidence to suggest that like this is happening globally and we're basically being sorted into two warring tribes that span the entire globe. And I think the evidence that comes from what people are experiencing in Europe and in Canada and in Australia and everywhere else, it kind of points in that direction that here in Canada today, where I'm visiting, they're having the election, and Pierre Poilievre is the candidate against Mark Carney, and it looks like Carney is going to probably prevail today. We'll see. But Poilievre kind of maps onto the same worldview as Trump's. So this is happening everywhere, and I think it goes even beyond this kind of like single in group out group division because there's all kinds of distinctions even within our parties. So for example, the Democrats can't really agree on what the direction forward is, and you've got two different factions at minimum within the Democrats around positions on, Israel, Palestine, and, who should be the standard bearer and what kind of rules of conduct we should adopt. And so, that's an issue. And then within the Republican Party, there are distinctions there. And I think the Democrats should probably do a better job of teasing apart those differences on the Republican side. But, looking at the structure of society and figuring out like how things are actually structured, what groups are sort of pitted against what other groups. And this is fundamentally what like the Cambridge Analytica people were doing. We need to do that, but in reverse. Figure out, okay, how can we build, engines that tie people back together into some kind of functional society where we can learn to actually see each other again. And, I think that, online interaction is kinda not great for that because it's so easy to dehumanize people in an
Yeah.
online context. But getting it more into in-person contexts, figuring out ways to knit human networks in ways that, matter, bringing people together in ways where, you might not know their politics, but you're still participating in something fun and in a community setting. And, you think about going to, like, festivals and that kinda thing, you see all kinds of people, you don't really know, their politics, but you can still manage to be decent and nice to people in those kinds of settings. And, I've even had the experience, I go to a lot of right-wing rallies to monitor them and see what's going on, and, people are nice, I look like a I am a
Right.
middle-aged white guy, like, I fit in. And so, everybody's always, pleasant, and they're not acting like Nazis or anything. So I think there's a ton of potential to be mined in kind of bringing ourselves back together, but we have to kind of first decide that that's something we want to do, and we have to look at the structural elements. I think too often people think about, ideology in terms of like beliefs that people have, and I would argue that mostly people are reflecting their social networks and the identity that they derive from where they belong socially. And so it's not like, people are like really, really believe some particular thing most of the time. There's some, obviously, if there are some beliefs that people hold firmly, but a lot of it is just this is in general what my group of people thinks, and this is what we say we think, and this is how we feel comfortable with each other. I think, once you can start to kind of scramble all that a little bit and get people to see the messiness of humanity and our relationships with each other, we might have a shot at getting our way out of it. So I've proposed things like, if we did something like, national service programs, I'm not talking about, military
Right.
necessarily, although that could be a part of it, but things like AmeriCorps, which we're currently in the process of gutting, if we made that much larger rather than smaller and then focused on bringing people together from across the major social divides, whether that's urban versus rural, rich versus poor, black versus white, whatever, just bring people together across all of these divisions that we have and get them to trust each other. And I would argue that we kind of did that as a natural experiment to some extent during, things like World War II, and, brought people together across a lot of different axes. And those people that had that experience ended up building the institutions that define the post-war era and that we're living under now. So, like, I think we underappreciate the degree to which that kind of mixing can help. And I think if we were intentional about it, we might get to go somewhere good. But then the question is, how on earth do we get American government to agree on anything as a pathway out? And I think to your point, we may have to experience kind of a breakdown before we sort of hit bottom and figure out a way out.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think that you brought up the military, right, which is World War II. My grandparents, I think all of my grandparents worked in it in one way or the other. Two grandfathers overseas. One grandmother actually worked at the Pentagon, right, as just as it was opening. And there were millions of people, whether or not it was that they'd been drafted together and put into a unit overseas, or they were working in the swing shift at a factory, right? These were people you, as you said, Dave, might not have otherwise run into. But now, we are able to curate in probably the greatest time ever, right? Our own existences. What do we see? What do we read? Who do we talk to? And, to the extent that we have to leave our houses, we probably go one of five places at any given time, right? Like nobody's like, oh, yeah, there's a grocery store 27 minutes from my house that's not quite as good as the one that's close to me. So, but I'm going to go there because I want to see somebody new and different. Like, nobody's going to do that. Yeah,
Right,
we've
right.
created these bubbles, and we've seen that with information too, right? Which is, I'm a conservative, so I watch Fox News. I'm a liberal, so I watch MSNBC, because that's the other part you said about the social piece, which is you want to not only reflect the things of the group you're part of, but also you want to have those reflected back upon you. It's always nicer to hear something you agree with than something you disagree with.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a really good book on that set of topics called Radical American Partisanship by Dr. Liliana Mason, who's at Johns Hopkins. Really just looks at how people have started to kind of self-sort into all of these different pockets that reflect their identity. So, first off, people are moving to neighborhoods where people are more like them. They don't want to live in places where, they think that there's people that hold opposite beliefs from them. And in fact, there's an interesting experiment she cites where if you told people that there were people in their neighborhood that were, of the opposite belief system than them, they would be less happy, even if you were lying about that
Right.
fact. And I think, we're all kind of guilty of it to some extent in that, we all just kind of want to feel like where we fit in. And, these days there's so many signals like, like you used to talk about grocery stores. Well, if if you shop at, one grocery store, you're perceived as liberal. If you shop at another one, you're perceived as, conservative or neutral or whatever. And, what kind of car you drive. I mean, Tesla and Cybertrucks and, I mean, it's everything is political. Everything is an identity signal these days. So I think, we've got to kind of get to the point where we can start to mix that stuff up a bit more. And I think when in the context of government, like, we're doing the same thing there. I mean, all of this Schedule F stuff means that, they can basically fire career professionals all throughout government, whether they, just based on their alliance to the executive or not. And it's, that's wrong. I mean, it's not only, kind of just morally objectionable, it's also bad for business for the US because we're, basically removing people that have expertise that, we kind of need. And we'll realize that someday.
If you go back through the last 100 years of ideology, and I'm sure it's longer than that, Dave, and you can tell me where my holes are. But like again, communism, promised everybody was going to be equal, right? Some utopia that was never going to exist. I finished this book called "They Thought They Were Free" about an American professor who went to Germany in 1953, 1954, and settled in this town Marburg, and he befriended 10 guys who were like run of the mill Nazis. They weren't party higher ups. They were all just regular. And I don't want to belittle it, but do you understand my point? They joined the party for a reason, and they were like, oh well, things were great when before the war. Everybody had a job. Vacations were $10. All these other things, and it sort of got me thinking, Dave, that like MAGA doesn't really promise to make your life better. Right? Like, there's always been sort of this fundamental idea that if you were gonna have an idea that you're gonna pitch to humans, it's, "Your life will be better if you put me in charge." Right? They don't even pretend to do that. They're like,
Yeah,
"No,
especially
we're
right
not gonna
now.
make your life better. We're gonna make your life harder, but you're gonna love us for it anyway."
Right. And I think it's because we talked about worldviews, and to some extent, they have been pitching this worldview of like, it's the Biden people that have done everything wrong, and it's all of these historical grievances that they've been selling, and the idea now is that because they're in charge, they have the opportunity to impose all of these worldview things, and that is going to somehow at least make them feel like things might eventually get better in some kind of future timeline. But in the near term, it's like, well, obviously there's going to be some pain because we have to like still undo all of this stuff from the old bad guys. So that's why they're actually being successful right now at blaming things on the previous administration. You hear them talk about what's going on with the stock market. Like, well, we're just unwinding all of the terribleness that happened of the Biden administration.
Right.
And it's like, well, okay. And the facts don't really indicate that, but, that's the story that they're going with, and, it's remarkably effective. So, I think they have promised that things are gonna get better, and, I mean, they're kinda not, and what's interesting too is you see that fault line in kind of the tech MAGA world too, where some of them are starting to go like, this seems bad, like, we didn't talk about this whole tariffs thing, and now my portfolio is down 12%, like, what's going on?"
Right.
And that's something I think, Democrats should do a better job of kind of teasing that apart, as I say, figure out where the dissent lies within the Republican Party and peel some of those people off. Because if you could get 20 members of Congress to defect from the sort of mainline MAGA, and come over to the Democratic coalition focused on some like sane priorities, you could you could peel off the House and maybe, more of the Senate, and like that would be worth doing. And I don't think it would be. I mean, it's hard, but it's not impossible hard.
Well, if you look back to Biden's administration, most of the signature things he got done with Republican votes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
They came
exactly.
across the line, especially in the United States Senate. They came across the line for that stuff.
When you kind of like get down to brass tacks of like stuff we actually need to do, like pass a budget or raise the debt ceiling, things like that, pretty much everybody in Congress, except for like the Freedom Caucus, wants that stuff to happen. So, you end up with like 70% bipartisan votes on those kinds of measures. And I think we need to frame more stuff in those kinds of terms because those are the things where most people agree on.
Well, and I've written a couple of pieces now. One that posted on Substack this morning as we're recording this, Dave, specific to that thing, which is the online resistance, and I put that in air quotes. Crowing about Trump's bad numbers, poll numbers, the worst poll numbers at 100 days of any president in history. And, like, I don't necessarily think he cares, right? Because he's not
Yeah.
going anywhere and it's only 3 months in. But I
Yeah.
said the place that you can and should use that is exactly what you were talking about, which is something I pitched to them 3 weeks ago. Go into swing Republican House districts or legislative districts that are high net worth and, lean Republican, and start saying Republican tariff craziness is wrecking your 401k,
Yep.
right?
Exactly.
And don't use Trump. Trump gives them something to hide behind.
Yeah, totally.
But getting our Democratic friends to understand, like, there are ways to do this, but you must actually put some work into it is exceedingly difficult, Dave. I
Well, and
gotta
you have
tell
to
you.
believe it's possible. And what I hear from a lot of Democrats is, they I think have a distorted sense of Republican unity, and because they're so galvanized against Republicans as being the enemy, they imagine that they are all always aligned and that they're all evil and that they're all part of the same cabal and outgroup and whatever. And like, yeah, sure, to some extent that's demonstrable. However, details matter. And, if you start to actually study the composition of those networks, you can find clear splits between, say, the Freedom Caucus crowd and the rest. I mean, there's some that are definitely getting talking points directly from Russia. I mean, there are cliques
Yeah.
in the Republican, Congress. And so I just think, you just go totally scorched earth in terms of like trying to figure out how to break up those coalitions and just do what you need to do. And what you said is one way to do it.
I said this a few weeks ago when they were passing the continuing resolution, or maybe it was the first test vote in the House on the tax cut stuff. And like Dave, I found myself agreeing with Thomas Massey for different reasons, right? But he's like, this is just more debt. This is ridiculous. These are the best case numbers, and they're terrible for the debt, right? And Massey's out there like the lone guy right now. Listen, I disagree with him on everything, and I think
Sure.
his
Yeah.
Christmas card with the guns and the kids is abominable. Abominable. But in that moment, I was like, yeah, listen to that guy. Right? Like, he's saying what we need to say.
Well, yeah, and that's my thing is like I'm always listening for what they're saying to see like where you can like latch on to things in terms of putting out messaging that helps people to frame things a little bit differently. Because as long as you believe that the Republicans are all going to be united, then they will be all united because that's you're giving them the license to do that.
Right.
So I don't know. I think there's so much chaos right now, and there are opportunities to kind of steer this in a different direction. And I think, Democrats need to kind of get more imaginative and creative in terms of how they approach this. And, start to figure out what a plan for the future of democracy is, too, rather than just defending things. I mean, defending the status quo, I mean, the status quo, as I said, is not that great. So, what is the future of global democracy? What are we going to do about the UN? Now, get we can't boil the ocean and do everything at once. But, like, what's the plan for the United States' leadership role with respect to democracy globally going forward? Are we going to continue to do that, or are we out of that game now? Like, what's the plan? And nobody seems to have any idea for that.
In the realm of, you know, dystopian futures, I mean, could we be that far away, Dave, from Donald Trump kicking the UN out of New York City?
I don't think so. I mean, I
right?
think that that's, very plausible, and I would also argue that the UN is, pretty creaky and maybe not fit for purpose, but, like, we need to have that conversation about, like, what if we don't really wanna do the UN anymore, is there some future way of organizing ourselves that would be, actually favoring democracy globally? And that's so I'm starting to have some of those conversations with people privately, and maybe we could talk more about that
Sure.
too, but these are the things that we need to be talking about, and for the most part, people are kind of dithering and not really, offering much in the way of leadership. So, a lot of work to be done.
I think the dithering and the lack of leadership is endemic, I think, to our friends on the left, which is we've had so many conversations. Well, Dave, if we do this, that bad thing could happen. If we do that, those bad things could happen. And also because so many of them are still stuck in a worldview that no longer exists. You have way too many people running around trying to position themselves for 2028 when, like, how do we know that's going to happen? Right. In
Right.
any way that we've ever expected it. And um, if your house is on fire with you in it, wouldn't be the first thing to like figure out how to put the fire out before you start looking for a new house. And I think that's because the things you're talking about are hard. They
Yeah.
require thought, they require work, and frankly, they require risk, which is a lot of them aren't going to work. And I think that the Democrats have been an adjunct, right, from an economic and socio-political system for the past 40 or 50 years, and now they're like, oh shoot, that doesn't work for us anymore. Now what? Right now we have to go have real thoughts on our own, and it can't just be us screaming, we're for the environment or we're pro-choice. Like, yeah, everybody knows. So what?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, like, what's your tactical plan for managing the next, I mean, really the next 2 years? Because I mean, as you say, I mean, I think what may happen in 2026 is, we've got a ton of influence coming in from the crypto industry, which is mostly mapping to the right, but they're going to the left as well.
Yep.
And the crypto industry kind of wants consolidation of power ultimately above all else. And, if you look at 2024, there was something on the order of like $200 million in pure crypto assets dumped in, and then another 250 or whatever from Elon. And I sort of put them into the same bucket. So that's like $450 million worth of investment. And you look at big oil, they did like 120. So, you're talking about maybe like a 4x, investment in from crypto over big oil, the next biggest thing. So, like, what is 2026 going to look like? Will people get just sort of overwhelmed by crypto money on both the left and the right? And, if that occurs, then we effectively are going to have this situation where, no matter which candidates you vote for, the ones you're going to hear about and the ones that are going to have the most support are going to be ones that are in service of this power consolidation agenda. I don't care whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And so, is that a real election? Is that, I mean, it's you're getting Coke or Pepsi, but it's still, cola. It's the
Right.
same thing. So, I think that, we need to pay more careful attention to kind of those dynamics. And I think the same thing may end up happening in 2028, where, we've got the emergence of this kind of abundance agenda that's being floated. And it's kind of like not that much different than some of the Doge ideas, honestly. And, so I mean, I think some of those conversations are worth having. I think, yeah, we probably need a lot more housing, and yeah, we probably should limit bureaucracy and streamline things. But, effectively, it's like left coded Doge
Yeah.
versus, right coded Doge. Which flavor Doge do you want? And it's kind of being run by similar networks of people. So, I think we just have to be, cognizant of the fact that there's a structural element that may play into both 2026 and 2028.
Right, and one thing on abundance, and I promise to let you go, Dave, is there's a lot of talk about how could they build so much housing in Texas? How could they build so much renewable energy in Texas? And then you look at California, who can't build 8 miles of high speed rail track. To the but like it's convenient to leave out the idea that like the power grid is disconnected from the rest of the country, so that when it fails, like people freeze to death.
Right,
Right,
right. There's
and
some
then
details,
and then the aftermath, what did they do? They didn't tell the grid operator or any of the providers to fix themselves, they paid them off, right? They gave
Right.
them $1 billion payoff in the legislature. So, like, that's the flip side was like, yeah, if you're okay with that stuff, right, great, but, like, that's not the rule of law either.
Yeah.
That's not good governance either. That's all just a bunch of very wealthy and very powerful people all working towards their own ends. And if Granny outside of Houston froze to death because the grid went offline, well, I guess, Dave, that's the cost of doing business.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, I think that we need to kind of take a realistic look at this. And, sure, I think anybody can recognize that, yeah, there's a lot of weird bureaucracy and, probably too many steps and a lot of things and things that need to be modernized. And, that's cool. Let's do those things. Let's clean it up. Let's, take reasonable steps. And I think a lot of the stuff that Doge is doing, there's a reason to look at those things, but at the end of the day, like, it should be done in a sensible, controlled process with, like, actual security and, not giving 19-year-old kids passwords to the, IRS and Social Security Administration and nuclear sensitive information. I mean, like, that's all just complete overreach, and it's insane. So, like, sure, let's clean up government, but, yeah, let's do so sensibly.
Yeah, with a slide rule and a pencil, not a flamethrower. All right, Dave, before we let you go, where can we find your work online?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on my website, America 2, it's America, then the number 2 dot news. So that's my publication called America 2.0. And then you can also find me on X at Dave Troy, on Mastodon at Dave Troy at Toad, TOAD dot social, and on Blue Sky at davetroy.com.
Awesome. As always, gang, you can find me on Substack at the home front, on Twitter, TikTok, and says.us at Reed Galen, on Instagram and threads at Reed_Galen USA. Dave, thanks for joining me. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Reed.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.